J.K. Rowling published a 3,700-word-long statement on her website on why she is a transphobe. No, that's not the word she used, but it's appropriate. So I wanted to make a response video, and then that video turned out to be very, very long, so I am going to publish two versions of it. One is the whole thing just as it is, it's very long, and the other one is the same thing just split into shorter segments that I will put in a playlist for anyone who wants to watch shorter clips instead of just one long one. This is the long version, so let's get into it and not make it any longer than it has to be. If you haven't read her statement, you do not have to. I am going to quote most of the things to you, and the things that I don't quote, I will still show on the screen if you want to read them. If you absolutely want to read the entire thing, I will not be providing a link, but it's easy to find. Again, it's on her website. And if you absolutely do not want to know what she said, I completely understand. You don't have to watch this video. Click off. I am not going to be offended. However, I am going to provide a bunch of links in the description, among them at least one video that doesn't quote almost anything of what Rowling said, just responds to it, and it is a great video, so I absolutely encourage you to watch that, even if you're also going to watch this one. So getting into it. I've seen people say that Rowling's statement is nuanced and respectful, and if you haven't read more than just a couple of paragraphs and didn't scratch too hard on the surface there, I can maybe understand why you would think so, but I will explain why it is not. The title of the essay is J.K. Rowling writes about her reasons for speaking out on sex and gender issues. And here is the first paragraph. This isn't an easy piece to write, for reasons that will shortly become clear, but I know it's time to explain myself on an issue surrounded by toxicity. I write this without any desire to add to that toxicity. Okay, fine. Sounds good, doesn't it? She's going to explain herself and she's not going to be toxic about it. Let's see what she says. For people who don't know, last December I tweeted my support for Maya Forstater, a tech specialist who lost her job for what were deemed transphobic tweets. Transphobic is in quotes. She took her case to an employment tribunal, asking the judge to rule whether a philosophical belief that sex is determined by biology is protected by law. Judge Taylor ruled that it wasn't. Some facts to get straight here. Maya Forstater did not lose her job. Her contract was up and she was not rehired after that. That is a big difference. She was not fired, they just decided to not renew her contract. Also, the judge did not rule that it was illegal to have a philosophical belief that sex is determined by biology. What the judge ruled was that Maya was not protected by law when she was consistently refusing to use the right pronouns for her transgender colleague. I think it was a colleague. I am not completely up to date on this. The point is that she was being transphobic and she was discriminating a trans person. At least one trans person. Possibly more. Again, I don't know. Either way, discrimination is illegal. And also, I covered this in my last video, but no one, save for maybe a few extremists somewhere, is arguing that biological sex isn't real. We know that sex is biological. All of our arguments are centered around gender, and gender being different than sex. Now, let's move on to the next paragraph. My interest in trans issues predated Maya's case by almost 2 years, during which I followed the debate around the concept of gender identity closely. I've met trans people and read sundry books, blogs, and articles by trans people, gender specialists, intersex people, psychologists, safeguarding experts, social workers, and doctors, and follow the discourse online and in traditional media. On one level, my interest in this issue has been professional because I'm writing a crime series set in the present day, and my fictional female detective is of an age to be interested in and affected by these issues herself. But on another, it's intensely personal, as I'm about to explain. Okay, so one, she is setting herself up as an expert, as someone who knows things about this, and yet she has obviously not understood what transgender rights are actually about. I'm going to get to that, but the point is that she is pretending to be very, very educated about this, so nothing that comes after this can be put down to just being ignorant. She has done her research and she has just rejected it or come to the wrong conclusions. And so everything she says with an understanding of the effects that it's going to have. That's the point here. Also, I don't know anything about this crime series. I haven't read anything other than Harry Potter by her. And doing research for books, I'm an author. Doing research for books is all well and good. And sometimes you have to do research into things that you don't agree with. And that's something that you should do, but I don't understand how that is relevant here. Either way, next paragraph. All the time I've been researching and learning, and accusations and threats from trans activists have been bubbling on my Twitter timeline. This was initially triggered by a like, When I started taking an interest in gender identity and transgender matters, I began screenshotting comments that interested me as a way of reminding myself what I might want to research later. On one occasion, I absent-mindedly liked instead of screenshotting. That single like was deemed evidence of wrongthink, and a persistent low level of harassment began. First thing I want to make very clear here is that harassment, threats, abuse, all of that, not okay. No matter your opinions and how they differ from other people's opinions, abuse, harassment, threats, never ever okay. And I do know that a lot of people were very, very angry and did make threats, and all of this happened. I'm not saying it didn't, and that is not okay. Just so we have that out of the way. However, while, like I said, research is all well and good, I cannot recall that this was ever explained. In the controversy that followed, when she had liked this and people were calling her out on it, not everyone was threatening, by the way. A lot of people were just wondering, what are you doing? Why did you do this? Do you hold these views? Please, can we educate you? And either way, I was pretty sure that it was explained as a middle-aged moment. In fact, I'm entirely certain that it was. The quote is, from Rowling's representatives, that she had a clumsy and middle-aged moment, and this is not the first time she has favorited by holding her phone incorrectly. Fine, we have all accidentally liked something at some point. I don't think there is anyone who hasn't done that. However, what she could have done here was to come out with a statement that I am very sorry that I accidentally liked this, I do not hold these views, I was looking this up because I was doing research for a book. It wouldn't have been harder than that, and the fact that they didn't do that kind of makes me at least think that there was actually no research involved, and this is something that she's just saying now. Moving on. Months later, I compounded my accidental like crime by following Magdalene Burns on Twitter. Magdalene was an immensely brave young feminist and lesbian who was dying of an aggressive brain tumor. I followed her because I wanted to contact her directly, which I succeeded in doing. However, as Magdalene was a great believer in the importance of biological sex and didn't believe lesbians should be called bigots for not dating trans women with penises, dots were joined in the heads of Twitter trans activists, and the level of social media abuse increased. Okay, so I will say I do not know a lot about Magdalene Burns. I have been looking up a little bit, and Rowling is painting her in a very, very favorable light here, compared to the things that I've found. Among them, this tweet, which I am not going to read out loud because I do not want to take these words in my mouth. But what she is saying in it is that trans women are not women, just men who get turned on by pretending to be women. And she is using very colorful language to explain this. Now, I know that there are lesbians who don't want to date trans women with penises. I also know that there are lesbians who don't mind. Just like there are cis men and others who are attracted to women who might not want to date a trans woman, potentially because she has a penis. That is perfectly fine. There is nothing wrong with that. But there is a difference between, I don't want to date you because I'm not attracted to your genitalia, and you are not actually a woman, just a man pretending. Also notice that once again, she could have issued a statement expressing her support for trans people and saying that she did not agree with Magdalene Burns' extreme views on trans women, but she did not do this. Next paragraph. I mention all this only to explain that I knew perfectly well what was going to happen when I supported Maya. I must have been on my 4th or 5th cancellation by then. I expected the threats of violence, to be told I was literally killing trans people with my hate, to be called cunt and bitch, and of course, for my books to be burned, although one particularly abusive man told me he'd composted them. We're getting to the bad stuff now, and we're not even halfway through, not even close. First, I hope that that last bit was just a very poorly timed joke, because if it wasn't, No. So what she does in this paragraph is, among other things, to shrug off and make light of the fact that people are telling her that she is harming trans people with these opinions. Of course, no trans person is going to read her tweet and immediately fall down dead. That is not what anyone is saying. What we are saying is that the views that she is expressing is harmful. Trans people are one of the groups who have the highest suicide rate in the world. I'm gonna cite sources down below for that. In my teens, I contemplated suicide a lot. I attempted it twice. And you wanna know the reason for that? The reason was that I was not feeling accepted. It was that I had to fight every day for the right to be myself. I had to constantly live with people misgendering me, and once I'd come out, I had to over and over and over again remind people to use the correct name and the correct pronoun. That is exhausting, and every time someone misgenders you, that hurts and it makes you wonder, is it even worth it? For anyone who's going through that right now, it is worth it. It is going to be better. And if you are around people who just refuse to learn, I'm sorry, you might have to cut them out of your life, because it's not worth it dealing with people who are just not willing to learn. I am very sorry. So Rowling's tweets and her opinions feed the trans hate. It feeds transgender people's uncertainties and feelings of utter loneliness and frustration, and it feeds the convictions of the people who keep questioning us. And people who question us directly lead to suicidal thoughts and attempts, and those people who actually go through with it and are no longer with us because of all this hate. I also want to say that once again, she brings up the threats of violence and abuse and all of that. And I want to say, A, once again, of course not okay. And B, a lot of us who responded by trying to educate her, by being as calm as we could, by expressing our anger and frustration and asking her to please not do this. There were those that were very disrespectful. There were those that were very, very respectful and much calmer than we really wanted to be. Let's go to the next one. What I didn't expect in the aftermath of my cancellation was the avalanche of emails and letters that came showering down upon me, the overwhelming majority of which were positive, grateful, and supportive. They came from a cross-section of kind, empathetic, and intelligent people, some of them working in fields dealing with gender dysphoria and trans people, who are all deeply concerned about the way a socio-political concept is influencing politics, medical practice, and safeguarding. They're worried about the danger to young people, gay people, and about the erosion of women's rights and girls' rights. Above all, they're worried about a climate of fear that serves nobody, least of all trans youth, well. Here she is pretending that she cares about trans people, particularly trans youth, but if she is as educated as a couple of paragraphs ago she pretended to be, or said she was, then she should know that questioning trans people is just in no way helpful and is actively harming this trans youth that she says she is so concerned about. Also note, this is something that I didn't catch at first, but Andrew James Carter on Twitter pointed it out. I'm going to link his Twitter thread down below. It is very good, very educational. And what he pointed out was that she said that she had gotten support from people who work in fields dealing with gender dysphoria and trans people. Exactly what fields and exactly what roles these people had, she doesn't say. So chances are that they are not experts in the field, that they are not medical professionals or psychologists or anything like that. And chances are that they are not working directly with trans people, or they are not working in fields that actually want to help trans people. They could literally be anyone working in any field and have absolutely no experience with trans people or the transgender issue. Which honestly, if they're supporting Rowling, I highly doubt that they have any expertise in the field, and I very much hope that they are not directly dealing with trans people who need help. Next. I'd stepped back from Twitter for many months, both before and after tweeting support for Maya, because I knew I was doing nothing good for my mental health. I only returned because I wanted to share a free children's book during the pandemic. Immediately, activists who clearly believe themselves to be good, kind, and progressive people swarmed back into my timeline, assuming the right to police my speech, accuse me of hatred, call me misogynistic slurs, and above all, as every woman involved in this debate will know, TERF. You were doing nothing good for your mental health? Think about the mental health of the trans people. It would have been way better for us if you just stayed off Twitter entirely. Or at least not spouted this kind of thing. Second, notice that she only wanted to share a free children's book to kids in these trying times, which is admirable. I am not saying it isn't. It is absolutely a good thing, and I'm sure it helped these kids a lot. I am sure they appreciated it. Really, I am not being sarcastic. I'm saying this was good. Truly a good thing to do. However, she brings it up here to imply that trans activists, what, ruined that book for the kids? Or ruin her image of being a through-and-through good person? I don't know. I really don't see the relevance. She's just painting her as a good person who just want to help children, and the trans activists as the bad people who are attacking her. Also, I'm once again saying throwing abuse, not okay, calling names, not okay. The term TERF, however, I'm gonna get to with the next paragraph. If you didn't already know, and why should you, TERF is an acronym coined by trans activists which stand for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. In practice, a huge and diverse cross-section of women are currently being called TERFs, and the vast majority have never been radical feminists. Examples of so-called TERFs range from the mother of a gay child who was afraid their child wanted to transition to escape homophobic bullying, to a hitherto totally unfeminist older lady who's vowed never to visit Marks and Spencer again because they're allowing any man who says they identify as a woman into the women's changing rooms. Ironically, radical feminists aren't even trans-exclusionary. They include trans men in their feminism because they were born women. I'll start there. I do not want to be included in anyone's feminism as a woman. That is not including trans people. That is including me as a woman while denying the trans part of me, the part of me that is a man, which is actually all of me. Not biologically speaking, but either way. They might think that they are including me, but by excluding the trans part of me, they are by definition trans-exclusionary. I don't understand how this is not clear. But I think the point she's making here is that she does not want to be called a TERF. She doesn't identify as a TERF, and I'm not entirely certain why, because it's not the trans-exclusionary part, because she is obviously excluding trans people. Maybe she doesn't identify as a radical feminist. Either way, she doesn't want to be called a TERF. Fine, I won't call her a TERF. I will call her a transphobe instead. See? It's that easy. Let's move on. But accusations of TERFery have been sufficient to intimidate many people, institutions, and organizations I once admired who are cowering before the tactics of the playground. They'll call us transphobic. They'll say I hate trans people. What next? They say you got fleas? Speaking as a biological woman, a lot of people in positions of power really need to grow a pair, which is doubtless literally possible, according to the kind of people who argue that clownfish prove humans aren't a dimorphic species. No one is saying that sex isn't real. No one is saying that humans can change their biological sex. Speaking as a biological woman, I know that I will always be a biological woman. I am very, very well aware of this. The other stuff in this paragraph, I'm not even gonna touch. So why am I doing this? Why speak up? Why not quietly do my research and keep my head down? Yes, why? Apparently, well, I've got 5 reasons for being worried about the new trans activism and deciding I need to speak up. I have a charitable trust that focuses on alleviating social deprivation in Scotland, with particular emphasis on women and children. Among other things, my trusts support projects for female prisoners and for survivors of domestic and sexual abuse. I also fund medical research into MS, a disease that behaves very differently in men and women. It's been clear to me for a while that the new trans activism is having, or is likely to have if all its demands are met, a significant impact on many of the causes I support because it's pushing to erode the legal definition of sex and replace it with gender. Okay, she has a couple of points here. Actually, she has a couple of points. There are diseases that do act very differently depending on if the person is a biological male or female. That is true. That is entirely true. And to be fair, I sometimes have to remind doctors that I see that I am biologically a woman, that I have ovaries. I had stomach pains for a long time. I went 15 months with extreme stomach pains. Turned out to be gallstones, but before I knew that, I had to remind every doctor or tell every doctor every time I went into the ER or saw a new doctor, I had to tell them that, hey, I am trans. I have a female reproductive system, because stomach pains can be a symptom of something being wrong with the female reproductive system, and that can be very, very dangerous if it's not treated. So yes, in certain medical situations, it is very relevant for the doctor to know the patient's biological sex. Now, I might be misinterpreting this, but it sounds to me that Rowling is saying that I should never have been allowed to change my legal sex, legal gender, whatever that is, either way, from woman to man, because it could confuse doctors. A doctor also needs to know if I have had major surgery before, what medication I'm on, if I have allergies or other chronic illnesses, and things like that. Those are questions that doctors need to ask all of their patients, and I do not see why we can't just train our doctors to also add a question about biological sex. It's a question that is probably going to make a lot of people very uncomfortable in the beginning, but they'd get used to it. Until then, transgender people are very, very well aware that we need to explain to our doctors what our biological sex is and what kind of surgeries and medication we're on because of that, for them to be able to treat us properly and understand what our symptoms mean. Now, this does not exclude doing research on these diseases like MS, for example, on how they are different for biological men and biological women. This is important to us too. We also want to be able to get the best care possible. And as for female prisoners and survivors of domestic and sexual abuse, these are not projects that are irrelevant to trans people at all. And I am very sad to hear that apparently trans women are being excluded from Rowling's projects into these things. That's not okay. Trans women can be prisoners, and they can and very often are survivors of domestic and sexual abuse. Projects that try to help women in these categories should not exclude trans women, because where are the trans women supposed to go? Where are they supposed to get their help? Moving on, let's see if she explains that, shall we? The second reason is that I'm an ex-teacher and the founder of a children's charity, which gives me an interest in both education and safeguarding. Like many others, I have deep concerns about the effect that trans rights movement is having on both. This paragraph is so vague I can't even comment on it. Who are the people having these concerns, and what kind of concerns are they having? If I knew the kind of concerns, maybe I could help calm you down. But honestly, I don't understand what effects the trans movement is having on education and safeguarding. So, yeah. The third is that as a much banned author, I'm interested in freedom of speech and have publicly defended it even unto Donald Trump. Okay, you said that these were the reasons that you were worried about the new trans movement, new trans activism. So is the trans activists trying to abolish free speech? That's not a part of any trans activism that I have seen. We are very much for free speech, thank you very much. The fourth is where things starts to get truly personal. I'm concerned about the huge explosion in young women wishing to transition, and also about the increasing numbers who seem to be detransitioning, returning to their original sex, because they regret taking steps that have, in some cases, altered their bodies irrevocably and taken away their fertility. Some say they decided to transition after realizing they were same-sex attracted, and that transitioning was partly driven by homophobia, either in society or in their families. Okay. More and more people of both biological sexes want to transition now because they have found out that that is an option. And as such, with more and more people transitioning, unfortunately, there will be a portion, a very, very small portion of those people who change their minds afterwards and want to detransition. That happens. I am not saying it doesn't. It is just not common at all. She's also making it out like when you have transitioned, you are, for lack of a better term, ruined. If I were to want to detransition, I would stop taking hormones, which would change my body fat distribution and my ability to build muscle. It would reduce body hair and facial hair, and my period would start up again. I would not regrow my breasts, but I could have implants put in to get those back if I wanted. My voice would also not change, but I could alter that myself. For the record, I have a much lower voice now, but only because the range of my voice has increased to be much lower than it was before. I can still speak with a much higher pitch if I wanted to, so I could just train myself to do that. And I know for anyone who has had bottom surgery, it's a different story. They won't be able to have biological children. And I know that people who want to go from a woman back to a man, in some cases have a harder time doing so. But what I'm saying here is that while it is bad, it is very unfortunate that some people, again, very, very few people, change their mind and want to go back to the way they were. And in many cases, that can't be done with, you know, coming back to exactly the way your body functioned before. Rowling is painting a worst case scenario here, which is not relevant to a lot of people. Also, I want to say that the options are not fully transitioning or staying the way you are. There are steps in between, and I know that at least my clinic here in Sweden is working very closely with their patients to find the best place to go to. If that is for a biological woman to have top surgery but not start taking hormones, or taking hormones but no surgery, or anything like that, they are trying to find the result that the patient is most comfortable with. And I don't think that my clinic here in Sweden is the only place that is taking very, very good care to make sure that their patients are happy. I hope that every clinic working with trans people are doing that. Also, I don't see it as a bad thing that more and more people are questioning their gender identity. A lot of the people who do start questioning their gender identity eventually decide that, no, it matches with my body, or it matches close enough with my body, and I know now that I have questioned it, what I can do to be more comfortable. And now that argument about people wanting to transition because they have realized that they're gay and they're trying to escape homophobia is absolutely ridiculous. This is something that I was asked when I was transitioning. Are you sure you're not just a lesbian? And it's just unfathomable to me how people can think that, okay, I want to escape homophobia, so instead I'm going to transition and face transphobia instead, which is in some cases much worse. And anyone who is homophobic, I am pretty sure, in my experience, they're also going to be transphobic. So this doesn't help at all. Not to mention, in my experience, again, this is not a scientific observation, it's just an observation among the trans people that I've met. It is quite common for trans people to also not be straight, whether they're gay or bi or whatever. So it's a weird argument from that standpoint as well. And also, just transitioning is a long process. It is painful, it is mentally exhausting, it is very expensive in many places. It is not an easy option for someone who doesn't dare come out as gay. I have so much to say about this, but we're gonna move on now. Most people probably aren't aware, I certainly wasn't until I started researching this issue properly, that 10 years ago the majority of people wanting to transition to the opposite sex were male. That ratio has now reversed. The UK has experienced a 4,400% increase in girls being referred for transitioning treatment. Autistic girls are hugely overrepresented in their numbers. First, I'm pretty sure she's misgendering here, and what was more common before was male to female transitioning, and now it is female to male instead. Just want to say that. Also, yes, again, in my experience, in my observation, it is relatively common for trans people to also be autistic. I don't see how it's relevant. Autistic people can still reach an informed and proper conclusion on their gender identity. The two are not even... I don't know why she brought that up. I also want to say that for someone who is scared about the transgender agenda, I guess, the 4,400% increase might look huge. It looks very, very scary, but I just want to look at the actual numbers there. Because in absolute numbers, I looked this up, apparently 40 biological girls were referred for gender treatment in, I don't remember the year now, but either way, 7 years later, in like 17, 18, something like that, the number was 1,806. And again, this is in the UK, so the population of the UK is, what, 65 million? It is, I wrote that up, 68 million, almost 68 million people. I don't know how many of those people are biological girls, but either way, in such a large population, under 2,000 biological girls being referred for gender treatment is not a huge number. And I also want to say that all of those biological girls are not going to end up transitioning. They are just questioning their gender identity, and many of them might decide that transitioning is just not for them. Also, like I've already said, it makes complete sense that more and more people are questioning their gender identity, and I do not see a problem with that, as long as their questions are met by professionals who are able to handle their questions in a respectful and qualified way, so that these people are not made more confused or feel like they are not being taken seriously. As long as they can have a good, respectful, informed conversation about gender identity and be helped to find their way to wherever they end up, there is absolutely no problem with more and more people questioning their gender identity. Now, let's move on, and here is a section that I'm not going to read out loud. You can pause the video if you want to read this, but basically it is a physician and researcher from the US who has expressed concern that social media is contributing to more and more youths questioning their gender identity. She published a paper, was criticized for it, and apparently her career was damaged. The part I am going to quote is, Littman had dared challenge one of the central tenets of trans activism, which is that a person's gender identity is innate, like sexual orientation. Nobody, the activist insisted, could ever be persuaded into being trans. This is true. I truly believe this. No one can be persuaded into being trans. People can, however, be persuaded into questioning their gender identity, like I said. And again, as long as they have someone qualified to talk about this, I believe that that will make them more secure in whatever gender they end up settling on, and also have a greater understanding of the difference between sex and gender, which is a good thing. And also, they might not actually settle gender fluid people exist and are also valid. Moving on, the argument of many current trans activists is that if you don't let a gender dysphoric teenager transition, they will kill themselves. In an article explaining why he resigned from the Tavistock, an NHS gender clinic in England, psychiatrist Markus stated that claims that children will kill themselves if not permitted to transition do not align substantially with any robust data or studies in this area, nor do they align with the cases I have encountered over decades as a psychotherapist. I haven't read this article. I also don't know how it looks in the UK, but I'm pretty sure that in the UK and most other places, just like in Sweden, children and teenagers are not allowed to transition. What they are allowed to do is take a medicine that will pause puberty. And they're allowed to do this if a doctor deems that it's a good idea. And if this child, when it is old enough, decides that they do want to transition, this transition is going to be much, much better. It's going to have a much, much better result than if they had gone through puberty. And if they decide that they do not want to transition, they can just stop taking this medicine and puberty will start back up and they will develop as the biological sex that they have. No harm has been done. This is not irreversible. They will just potentially go through puberty a little bit later than most others. And once again, you are not necessarily dealing with children killing themselves the moment that they find out that they're not allowed to transition. But a trans person who is forced to live as their biological sex for their entire life or for a long time is at a very, very, very high risk of depression and suicide. Let's go to the next one. The writings of young trans men reveal a group of notably sensitive and clever people. The more of their accounts of gender dysphoria I've read, with their insightful descriptions of anxiety, dissociation, eating disorders, self-harm, and self-hatred, the more I've wondered whether if I'd been born 30 years later, I too might have tried to transition. The allure of escaping womanhood would have been huge. I struggled with severe OCD as a teenager. If I'd found community and sympathy online that I couldn't find in my immediate environment, I believe I could have been persuaded to turn myself into the son my father had openly said he'd have preferred. It sucks that her father openly said to her that he wished she was a boy. Any trans person will sympathize with that. That is not okay behavior on the part of a parent. However, this paragraph is implying that trans men only want to transition to escape the hardships of being a woman. Here's the thing, it is incredibly, incredibly difficult to explain gender dysphoria to someone who has never experienced it. I cannot explain what it feels like because it doesn't feel like anything else that I have ever experienced. So it is easy to focus on the things that Rowling lists here, anxiety, dissociation, eating disorder, self-harm, and so on, because those are things that people understand. But that's not all there is. It is different. And again, I cannot explain how it is different. So just because you have experienced anxiety and self-harm and self-hatred and all of that in your teens doesn't mean that you would have been helped by transitioning unless all of that anxiety and self-harm and self-hatred was directed at your own gender, your own biological sex. I can't explain it. Also, I know people with OCD, and as far as I know, they have never considered transitioning in an attempt to, cure their OCD? That's another irrelevant thing to even bring up. I don't understand why she did it. Then follows another paragraph that I'm not going to read out loud. Again, you can pause if you want to read it yourself. Basically, she is saying that it makes sense for women to want to become men because women are discriminated against, which makes no sense because trans people do not escape being discriminated against. And then she says, as I didn't have a realistic possibility of becoming a man in the 1980s, it had to be books and music that got me through both my mental health issues and the sexualized scrutiny and judgment that sets so many girls to war against their bodies in their teens. Fortunately for me, I found, and so on. Basically, books and music told her that it's okay to be confused and to be not stereotypically female. You can be a girl anyway. Again, ironic, because this is exactly the thing we're saying about trans women. They don't have to be biological female or even be particularly feminine to be women. Basically, this entire paragraph it's implying that if you are feeling confused about your gender identity, you do not have to seek medical help and therapy for it. You can just read books and listen to music and you will find yourself. This is not the case for people who are actually experiencing gender dysphoria. This is actually a very, very dangerous thing to say to them. If you are experiencing gender dysphoria, or if you think that that might be what you are experiencing, seek help from medical professionals and therapists who know things about transgender issues, because they can help you figure out what it is you're experiencing and how to best help you. Books and music are great, but they are not the answer to gender dysphoria. Next paragraph reads, I want to be very clear here. I know transition will be a solution for some gender dysphoric people, although I'm also aware through extensive research that studies have consistently shown that between 60 and 90% of gender dysphoric teens will grow out of their dysphoria. Yes, many teens who question their gender identity will settle on it matching their biological sex, or at least settle on transitioning not being for them. This is good. This is not a problem. And the doctors and psychiatrists and everyone who is actually an expert in this field tend to be pretty good at helping teens decide where they are before they suggest any drastic measures like hormones or surgery. She's not mentioning that in this part of the essay, but that is the case. These teenagers will question their gender identity. They will talk to professionals who will help them come to a conclusion of what their gender identity is and how best to help, if help is needed. Next bit. Again and again, I've been told to just meet some trans people. I have. In addition to a few younger people who were adorable, I happen to know a self-described transsexual woman who's older than I am and wonderful. Although she's open about her past as a gay man, I've always found it hard to think of her as anything other than a woman, and I believe and certainly hope she's completely happy to have transitioned. First, is it just me, or is it super patronizing to be referring to these younger trans people she's met as adorable? It just rubs me the wrong way. Also, once again, I don't know anything about this trans woman that J.K. Rowling knows. I hope she's very happy. I am glad Rowling isn't misgendering her, but it is actually irrelevant that she has one transgender friend who may or may not be okay with her views on transgenderism, because she doesn't actually say that. Being older, though, she went through a long and rigorous process of evaluation, psychotherapy, and staged transformation. The current explosion of trans activism is urging a removal of almost all the robust systems through which candidates for sex reassignment were once required to pass. A man who intends to have no surgery and take no hormones may now secure himself a gender recognition certificate and be a woman in the sight of the law. Many people aren't aware of this. Again, I don't see a problem. Hormones and surgery are not required for you to be allowed to identify and be identified as the gender that you identify as. Also, again, I don't know how this law actually works, but I highly doubt that a person can just go say that, hey, I'm a woman, or hey, I'm a man, and get that gender recognition certificate. Yeah, again, I don't know this, but I'm pretty sure there are some safeguards in place. Don't quote me on that, though. What you can quote me on is that we are not urging the removal of these systems. We are urging for them to change. Many trans people who have gone through this have been asked irrelevant and invasive questions throughout the process of transitioning, or before we were allowed to start transitioning. I myself was asked if and how I masturbated and how I could be certain that I wasn't a woman since I had never had sex. This implies then that this psychiatrist thought that if I could enjoy having sex with my female genitalia, I couldn't possibly be a man. And there are just so many things wrong with that. So those are examples of the ridiculous inquiries that we want to remove. I'm not going to read this next one out loud either. She is saying that things have become worse for women since the 80s because of porn and the backlash against feminism. She brings up Trump, incels, and trans activists in the same sentence as apparently equal enemies to women. Very classy. I've read all the arguments about femaleness not residing in the sexed body and the assertions that biological women don't have common experiences, and I find them too deeply misogynistic and regressive. I am actually not sure what this sentence means. I'm not sure if she's being unclear or if it's just me, but I honestly can't seem to understand. What arguments is she saying that she has read, and how are they misogynistic and regressive? If she gave us some examples, I think maybe I would be able to answer this, but right now I don't know. It's also clear that one of the objectives of denying the importance of sex is to erode what some seem to see as the cruelly segregationist idea of women having their own biological realities, or, just as threatening, unifying realities that make them a cohesive political class. The hundreds of emails I've received in the last few days prove this erosion concerns many others just as much. It isn't enough for women to be trans allies. Women must accept and admit that there is no material difference between trans women and themselves. Again, the first part of this I do not follow. I don't know if this is a language thing, if it's on me or her, but I don't follow, so I can't comment on it. That last bit, though, about no material difference between trans women and cis women, no one is saying that there is no difference. I have been through this over and over and over again. Biological sex is real, biological sex matters, but it is not the end-all be-all. But as many women have said before me, woman is not a costume. Woman is not an idea in a man's head. Woman is not a pink brain, a liking for Jimmy Choos, I don't know what that is, or any of the other sexist ideas now somehow touted as progressive. Moreover, the inclusive language that calls female people menstruators and people with vulvas strike many women as dehumanizing and demeaning. I understand why trans activists consider this language to be appropriate and kind, but for those of us who'd had degrading slurs spat at us by violent men, it's not neutral, it's hostile and alienating. You are making these terms hostile and alienating. There is nothing innately in them that is hostile or alienating. Again, this installment of this whole issue started with Rowling tweeting about an article where she wanted the words "people who menstruate" replaced by "women." I have explained in a previous video why people who menstruate and women are not equal. They do not mean the same thing. People who menstruate include women who do menstruate, but not women who don't. It includes trans men and non-binary people and gender fluid and anyone who menstruates regardless of if they identify as a man or a woman. Rowling is the one alienating the people who do not identify as women who menstruate by implying that you need to be called a woman to be allowed to menstruate. And I have never seen menstruators or person with vulva be thrown around as a slur or an insult. And if you take it that way, I'm sorry, but that's on you. So now let's talk about the fifth reason that Rowling is concerned. Yes, the past I don't know how many minutes have been only reason number 4. So the fifth reason, she starts off by talking about how she was abused and sexually assaulted by her ex-husband, which I think we can all agree is horrible. Those kinds of things should not happen to anyone, and I am completely sympathetic of the pain that this cost Rowling and the bravery that it actually takes to talk about these things. I am absolutely on her side in that particular bit of what she's saying. Now, the part in these next couple of paragraphs that I want to quote is this: "I am mentioning these things now not in an attempt to garner sympathy, but out of solidarity with the huge numbers of women who have histories like mine, who've been slurred as bigots for having concerns around single-sex spaces." I understand truly that women with this kind of past, and even women without this kind of past, want a safe space away from men. I entirely, completely support that. I don't have experience with domestic violence, but I do have experience with sexual abuse, and I completely understand that women who have been treated this way by men want a space away from men. I can even understand, from a certain point of view, how they might be uncomfortable in the presence of trans women who they perceive as looking like men. It is not rational, but I can understand the deep-rooted fear and visceral instinct. However, this does not give them the right to exclude certain women from their safe places. For one, they are excluding women solely based on the fact that they look like men. I am wondering, first of all, where are these women supposed to go? Do they have to go to male spaces where they are not going to feel safe either, for the same reasons? that cis women are not feeling safe in male spaces? Do they have to have their own places for only women who look like men? I don't understand the option that you're advocating for here. Also, and this becomes my question every time something like this is brought up, what about trans men? Could I walk into one of these women-only places and you would welcome me? I don't think so, because you would look at me and you would see a man, and then all of a sudden it is not the biological sex you are concerned with the appearance of the person, and if you think that they look too much like a man, you want to exclude them from your safe space. Now, Rowling doesn't say explicitly that trans men are not welcome into these safe spaces. I've never actually seen anyone who holds these kinds of opinions say that trans men are not welcome, but I just have a feeling that we wouldn't be, and for the record, I absolutely don't think we should be. Now, the next paragraph is that she feels solidarity and kinship with any trans woman dying at the hands of a violent man because she's been there herself. Again, horrible that she has had that experience, but inexcusable that she doesn't want trans women to have safe spaces to talk about things like this with other women who have experienced the same things, when she has explicitly said that trans women are also in danger of these things. And then she says that the majority of trans people are no threat, but are in fact just as vulnerable as a cis woman, although she doesn't use the word cis, and that we need and deserve protection. Once more, great, but... So I want trans women to be safe. At the same time, I do not want to make natal girls and women less safe. When you throw open the doors of bathrooms and changing rooms to any man who believes or feels he's a woman, and as I've said, gender confirmation certificates may now be granted without any need for surgery or hormones, then you open the door to any and all men who wish to come inside. That is the simple truth. I have never understood why bathrooms have to be segregated by gender. I will say that openly. I don't understand. You have stalls and you have doors and locks to those stalls, so what is the difference if you have a man or a woman in the stall next to you? With changing rooms, what is the concern here? Because I can see two different concerns, I think. One is that you're worried about men coming into the women's changing rooms and assaulting or raping women in there. To this I say, I am sorry, but any man who is going to do that is going to find a way to do that. He's not going to care if he's not allowed in this space. If he can find a way to get in, he will get in. And I know that sounds like I'm saying that you are never safe, and in a way that is true, and that is another issue that we should definitely be doing something about, because this is not a situation that is good or okay in any way. It's just unfortunately kind of the situation we're in. Although I will say that I don't think changing rooms are really the place that you need to be worried. The point is, I have never seen anything that proves that allowing trans women into a changing room is going to increase the danger of sexual assaults happening in that changing room. The next potential concern I can see is men going into the women's changing room and looking at women in there. Because I can understand how that would be uncomfortable. Believe me, I can completely understand how it would be uncomfortable to have someone look at your body and judge it. And I know that a lot of women are already experiencing that. I have experienced it as a woman when I was still not passing as a man. It is horrible. It is, yeah, I completely understand that you don't want that. I can also understand that there's a difference between a man looking at you like that and another woman, because let's not forget, women can also look at and appreciate other women's bodies. But I can understand that if someone you perceive as a man looking at you like that, you will feel a lot more threatened than if you catch a woman looking at you like that. Again, however, trans women are not going to go into the changing rooms to goggle. They are going to go in to get changed. They're going to do it quickly because they're going to be very uncomfortable, because their bodies get judged a lot. By men and by women. So, yeah. And I also, again, can't help wondering, where do you want trans women to go? Do you want them to go into the men's changing rooms? Because they're not safe in there. I am very sorry. This is another thing that we need to do something about, but trans people are not safe in men's locker rooms. They are a lot less safe as one person in a room full of men than a room full of women would be with one man comes in there. When I go into a changing room, I always get changed in the bathroom. I do not get undressed in front of a room of men because that is uncomfortable and makes me feel very, very unsafe. This does not mean that I want to go into the women's changing room instead. Just, consider that if a trans woman goes into the men's changing room, they are going to be unsafe. If she instead goes into the women's changing room, you might be made uncomfortable, but you're not going to be unsafe. This makes it sound like every woman would be uncomfortable if a trans woman comes into their changing room. Most women, as far as I have seen, would not be uncomfortable with that. Some women would be, and that is on them. That is something that they have to work on. Anyway, then Rowling finally gets to Saturday. So she read that the Scottish government is proceeding with its controversial gender recognition plans, which will in effect mean that all a man needs to become a woman is to say he is one. I don't know what this law or this gender recognition plan is, but from what I've understood, it's the same kind of law that exists in a lot of other places where it has not been a problem. Anyway, Rowling writes that she was triggered by this, remembering a specific sexual assault, and I can absolutely sympathize. In a way. Again, sexual assault is terrible, and anything that reminds us of it is painful, and it's obviously a trigger. But in this case, she was triggered by something that wasn't actually threatening, and either way does not excuse doing what she did. And what she did was tweeting the things that I talked about in my previous video. Again, those tweets were transphobic. They were hurting trans people, many of whom have the same experience of sexual assault as Rowling does. Well, I don't know if they have the same experience, I don't know the details, but either way, many of whom have been similarly traumatized by sexual assault and things like that as Rowling had been. Again, this kind of trauma is real, it is horrible, but it does not excuse hurting other people. Next she writes, it would be so much easier to tweet the approved hashtags because of course trans rights are human rights and of course trans lives matter. Scoop up the woke cookies and bask in a virtue signaling afterglow. There is joy, relief and safety in conformity. As Simone de Beauvoir, I can't pronounce that, I'm sorry, also wrote, without a doubt it is more comfortable to endure blind bondage than to work for one's liberation. The dead too are better suited to the earth than the living. Well, I mean, I guess I'm glad that you're at least not fake apologizing to us. That's something. Huge numbers of women are justifiably terrified by trans activists. I know this because so many have got in touch with me to tell their stories. They're afraid of doxing, of losing their jobs or their livelihoods, and of violence. There is no excuse for anyone to make these kinds of threats, but I just want to say that these kinds of threats are things that trans people live with daily and that are being made worse by Rowling's tweets. But endlessly unpleasant as its constant targeting of me has been, I refuse to bow down to a movement that I believe is doing demonstrable harm in seeking to erode woman as a political and biological class and offering cover to predators like few before it. I stand alongside the brave women and men, gay, straight and trans, who are standing up for freedom of speech and thought and for the rights and safety of some of the most vulnerable in our society. Young gay kids, fragile teenagers and women who are reliant on and wish to retain their single-sex spaces. Polls show these women are in vast majority and exclude only those privileged or lucky enough never to have come up against male violence or sexual assault, and who have never troubled to educate themselves on how prevalent it is. Again, I have to repeat myself, trans rights do not erode women's rights. We are not saying that biological sex isn't real. We are not saying that women should not have all the rights and more that they already have and have fought for so long. Also earlier, Rowling herself admitted that trans people are among the most vulnerable groups, but here she is not including them in the people that she wants to protect. Like I've said before, trans people love freedom of speech. But we will speak up against anyone who uses their freedom of speech to spread hate and falsehoods that harms our community and us personally. I would also have loved to see these polls that she was referring to, because all the polls that I have seen point to most people, most women, being comfortable with trans people. So there's that. The one thing that gives me hope is that the women who can protest and organize are doing so, and they have some truly decent men and trans people alongside them. Ah yes, women, men and trans people. Those are the three genders. Political parties seeking to appease the loudest voices in this debate are ignoring women's concerns at their peril. In the UK, women are reaching out to each other across party lines, concerned about the erosion of their hard-won rights and widespread intimidation. None of the gender-critical women I've talked to hates trans people. On the contrary, many of them became interested in this issue in the first place out of concern for trans youth, and they're hugely sympathetic towards trans adults who simply want to live their lives, but who are facing a backlash for a brand of activism they don't endorse. The supreme irony is that the attempt to silence women with the word TERF may have pushed more young women towards radical feminism than the movement's seen in decades. Yes, they are sympathetic to trans adults who just want to live their lives and not fight for their own rights. There are trans people who are happy with the way society looks right now. There are trans people who are maybe not as happy but just don't want to fight for whatever reason. But the vast majority of us do want to see change. Change that once again does not include robbing cis women of any of their rights. The last thing I want to say is this. I haven't written this essay in the hope that anybody will get out a violin for me, not even a teeny weeny one. I am extraordinarily fortunate. I'm a survivor, certainly not a victim. I've only mentioned my past because, like every other human being on this planet, I have a complex backstory which shapes my fears, my interests, and my opinions. I never forget that inner complexity when I'm creating a fictional character, and I certainly never forget it when it comes to trans people. All I'm asking, all I want, is for similar empathy, similar understanding to be extended to the many millions of people whose sole crime is wanting their concerns to be heard without receiving threats and abuse. Well, good, because I have no violin for you. I'm sorry you've gone through horrible things. I am glad you got out of the situation, but your complex backstory does not excuse the way that you are harming trans people like myself with your transphobia. And literally just here when I was making the notes for this video did I realize J.K. Rowling is actually Snape. Think about that for a moment. Now, the last thing that I want to say on this subject, and the last thing that I will say unless Rowling digs this pit any deeper, is that trans rights do not exclude women's rights. Luckily, there are a lot of reasonable people who realize that we can fight for both, and I can only hope that they and we can make a difference, can make a change, and prove that cis people and transgender people and everyone in between can live in peace and harmony and all have the basic human rights that we deserve. Thank you for listening to this lengthy rant. Be safe, be respectful. I'm gonna go drink some water now.